for coming. I was very lucky to be able to speak about a topic very similar to this one at Ethereal in New York City in May. And luckily I've had an extra 4 months to kind of iterate on the topic and spend some more time developing the thesis. And so I'm happy to be able to share with you guys today the next version of this talk, which is weaving cultural fabrics with tokens. And the key, if you guys walk away from this with any idea, the key is that if you can build a token, if you can build a culture, then you can rebuild the world. So to begin, as many of you might have already known, people aren't always rational. Emotions blind our decision-making all the time. As much as we'd like to pretend we're always rational, this simply isn't the case. As well, rationality, of course, requires very, very strong forecasting abilities. Again, humans are terrible at trying to predict the future, and so often it's kind of a futile exercise to try. But most importantly, humans are not computers. We operate with dynamic rule sets, which are constantly changing. We're constantly changing the way we interact with ourselves, and therefore we're constantly changing the way we interact with other people around us. And so obviously the question becomes, amidst all this irrationality among humans, why bother working together? Of course, the primary benefit that we see pretty commonly in a capitalist state is the benefit of pooling our resources for scale. This gives us access to investment opportunities, and in general, high capital investment required opportunities. We can then pursue them. And also for decentralized networks, the network is of course much stronger when there are more participants within it. Next, we have the idea of, or the benefits of idea generation. Again, ideas move much more quickly in groups than they would, obviously, if you were an individual. And as well, they benefit from multiple perspectives, which helps them develop even further. And of course, that helps the group work together if they have shared goals. And finally, love. People are great. We should work together. We're often much happier when we work with other people rather than alone. And so, love is a pretty great reason to pull us together. So if we know we want to work together and we know we have these changing individual rules, how do we go about actually doing that? Well, the first thing we need to do is actually develop and agree upon these kind of fixed rules that we can use to govern our interactions. And these are going to be really important. Next, what we can do is actually write software that actually embodies those rules, that executes them and enforces them in a very consistent fashion. And so we don't have to worry as much about humans enforcing or executing on these rules. We can kind of rely on our computers because, of course, computers are very good at executing consistent rules. That's kind of what they're built for. And so then the question becomes, of course, how do we get people to agree on a set of rules? Launch a token. Now, I know in 2019 that might seem like a very strange thing to say. The token markets have mostly dried up. But I'm going to take you a walk through the Bitcoin playbook, and hopefully it'll become a little bit clearer about why it makes sense to launch a token if you want to get people to work together. So, Bitcoin. When Bitcoin launched, step one was creating a set of rules which will govern the way that people interact. Step two is you can create a token and, of course, an accompanying protocol which can embody those rules. Step three is you can get people around the world to care about your rules, to run your protocol, to transact in your token. And finally, step four, you can distribute your token to maximize the likelihood of actually achieving the goals that you set out to achieve. And so, looking at Bitcoin, steps 1 and 2 are really where Bitcoin has succeeded far above any other protocol we've seen. And I want to dissect a couple reasons why. So, in step 1, when I say create a set of rules, really what I'm talking about here is goals and values. Goals, of course, being the kind of end states you want to achieve, the things you're optimizing towards. For Bitcoin, this is, self-sovereign, non-inflating money that is free from any nation state or central bank, but can exist, by the people. And the values, of course, are kind of the ways you go about achieving those goals. So for Bitcoin, again, it's scarcity and decentralization, anonymity, rationality, singularity. If you ask any Bitcoiner, their kind of goal is to make Bitcoin the last money that can ever exist, despite the fact that that's not only unlikely, but really not going to happen. And the second thing I wanted to mention here is the idea of a focal point. A focal point is something that is kind of a fulcrum around which people can organize. My favorite example of a fulcrum of a focal point, is the disco ball at a dance or at a party. And again, that's the kind of object around which the entire party will organize, and it draws people in. And focal points are traditionally, they can be symbols, they can be people, they can be events, and now, as of 2018, they can be tokens, which is incredibly interesting. So if we know kind of, how to go about step 1, how to go about step 2, really where the challenges arise are step 3 and 4. So, step 3, how do you get people to actually go about caring about your rules? Well, the primary answer, of course, is you build a culture. You think about the focal points which can embody the goals and values that you have. You think about the people who can actually go about perpetuating those goals. When you're building a culture, you want to actually accelerate towards this critical mass that's necessary for network effects to take hold. And if you're talking about Bitcoin, again, this is something Bitcoin's achieved that not really any other token has been able to, which is that Bitcoin's in so many people's minds and hearts that at this point it's really not going anywhere, despite the fact that many regulatory agencies around the world wish that wasn't the case. And finally, of course, when building a culture, you want to let it evolve naturally. If you try too hard, people can tell and it'll just turn out weird. Kind of like when old people try to fit in with their kids. And of course, the next step is you want to capture people's hearts and imaginations. You want to make them feel empathy for the people whose problems are being solved by the achievement of these new goals. And you want to get people excited about what's possible after those goals are achieved. And if you can do both of those things, you can kind of get their attention, you can make them feel something. And so really what's at the core of this is you want to build human connection among the community members who are drawn in to this idea, the token, the community, and you want to get them connected to each other and feeling that. So if you can get people to care about your rules, what happens next? So we know people and money will then start flowing into your ecosystem. This will be people who are willing to earn your token or transact in your token, which is incredibly important. People who are willing to perpetuate that culture, who will embody it, who will share it with their friends, which again is critical for growing the network. And finally, people who are willing to buy and hodl your token. Again, this is very, very critical for the sort of economics of the system. So, what happens, again, if we have this inflows of money and people into an ecosystem? Well, number one is that we can see that protocols can start natively rewarding the activities that they want to see done with the protocol. For instance, with Bitcoin, every time a Bitcoin block is mined, some Bitcoins are given to the miner. Again, this is only possible because the Bitcoin network has convinced enough people that Bitcoin are valuable enough for people to be interested in earning them. Next, people can then start breaking down these kind of larger, more ephemeral goals into these much smaller tasks, which can either be outsourced externally to people outside of the community or internally to people within the community. And again, you can reward them with a native token, and if money's flowing in, these people can transact externally. Of course, if there's no money flowing in, all you're really doing, you sort of need a circular economy where the people earning the tokens can then spend them in some capacity. And unless your ecosystem, covers the stack from, people's food and rent all the way to, the work that they do and the content they consume, people are eventually going to need to cash out. They're going to need a way to turn their community currency into these external currencies. And that's only really possible if there's money flowing into the ecosystem as well. And then, of course, if that happens, if the money's been given out, if the tasks have been completed, then the community actually starts achieving their goals. Again, this is what we've seen with Bitcoin, that Bitcoin gets printed, the blocks get mined, and now we have this self-sovereign money. So, just to recap, we can achieve these like very, very large, very, very global scale goals that were never really possible by following these steps. Number one, we decide on a set of goals and values that will bind us together. Step 2, we'll launch tokens and protocols which will embody those goals and values and will help enforce them. Step 3, we will create the cultures that can embody those goals and values, that capture people's hearts and attentions, and that give people a reason to work together. And finally, we can actually transact with those tokens to intelligently distribute them to the people, again, who embody those goals and values while helping them achieve those goals. So, this seems fairly straightforward, and of course, it seems like all our work is done. Unfortunately, that's not the case. There's a number of challenges which are still open, which Bitcoin hasn't really figured out, and we're kind of in the process of figuring out in the Ethereum ecosystem. Challenge number 1, how do you get people to figure out those goals and values if they aren't explicitly stated? The closest thing we have to this in the Bitcoin ecosystem, for instance, is the Bitcoin white paper. Some people will tell you the goals and values that are in that white paper are above all others, and others will tell you that they shouldn't be, that we should be more fluid and dynamic with those goals and values. And this becomes a challenge, of course, when we can't all agree on those and when they aren't explicitly stated. Now, the best way I've seen to solve this is, through forking, and blockchains actually give us the benefit of that. That if you don't like the goals and values embedded in the chain, you can fork and change those goals and values. You can embody new ones, and that's entirely possible. The next challenge, of course, is how do you get people to care? How do you get people to build a culture out of nothing? I gave some examples of this earlier, but this is an incredibly difficult problem that still remains very much open. And finally, how do you intelligently disperse funds? How do you allocate capital? How do you, when you have a bunch of tokens, how do you give it to the right people who are going to help you achieve those goals? How do you find those people? And this is, again, a very difficult problem, one that I'm personally very interested in solving, but very much remains open. And so the benefit for us, the great news, is that for most of you guys in the audience, technologists, these aren't technical problems. These are problems which have been solved by sociologists, psychologists, people who don't know how to write code but know how to, understand people. And most of these people problems, as you guys have seen in the Ethereum ecosystem, the number of people who are able to solve them is increasing as time goes on. It's becoming fewer and fewer technologists in the space, and more we're seeing people who understand how people work. And so this, of course, is to our benefit because like I mentioned, building a protocol, building a token is great, but that's only really step 1 and 2. And step 3 and 4 don't really require technology as much as they require people skills. So why does this matter? Well, of course, the Ethereum ecosystem is starting to discover that, what are the goals and values that bring us together, and of course, what are the ones that differentiate us from the other communities around us. For instance, people like to say that people in the Ethereum ecosystem are more open-minded than Bitcoiners. This is typically true. And of course, we're more of a real blockchain than EOS. Again, this is kind of our core principle. As well, this matters, of course, because expectations of financial gain are a great way to pull people into an ecosystem, but ultimately it's the culture that will keep them within the ecosystem once they've kind of entered. And so we should be very intentional about crafting that culture that will keep people in, even through the kind of cyclical nature of our markets. And finally, now this matters because we're starting to think about these much bigger goals. Not only can we think about, okay, we have our own money that's kind of free from the nation states, but now we can start to think about, what are the other goals we have that are kind of even broader than that. If we're thinking really big, how can we kind of go about bringing abundance into the world using a model like this one? And so for any of you guys in the audience, of course, who are part of the Ethereum ecosystem, we should be asking ourselves, how can we go about being intentional by defining our goals and values as a whole, as a community? How can we be intentional about building a culture that draws people in and captures their hearts? And of course, being at events like this one is a pretty great way to do that. And finally, we should be, intentional about focusing on our final goals. We should be figuring out what those are and optimizing towards them rather than getting distracted with these petty competitions with ETH killers. Because ultimately, the number of transactions per second doesn't really matter if the kind of goals and values we've set out to achieve don't really exist. Things like decentralizing, access to power, or access to money, or the ability to create your own money. If people aren't really doing that, the number of transactions per second doesn't matter at all. And so the key takeaways for you guys, again, like I said, if you're in the Ethereum ecosystem, please go home, ask yourself, what are the goals and values that you believe Ethereum embodies, and think about how you can go about building a culture that embodies those goals and values that you believe we should have. For those of you in the audience who have your own token or whose startup has your own token, be intentional about setting your goals and values. I hope you guys know what those are by this point, but be intentional about perpetuating them, about growing the distribution, because ultimately that's going to be the key to helping you achieve your goals, and that's really where it starts. And finally, for those of you out there who have very big goals but don't really know how to go about achieving them, if you can explicitly state your goals and values, if you can launch a token, then you can create these new ecosystems kind of out of thin air, which is incredibly exciting, I think, for anyone who's seen this done before. So that's all for today. If you guys want to get in touch, I'm at Mark Beylin on most platforms. I work on a project with a group of wonderful people. The project's called Bounties Network. We're really focused on the kind of problem of, when you have a set of tokens, how do you distribute them intelligently to people? And so we work with startups to help them outsource their tasks, either to teams or to individuals. And of course, you can find me here. And I want to give a shameless plug. We just recently launched a documentary that we made in Manila in the Philippines almost a year ago. And basically, we went out and paid people in ETH to pick up trash, to pick up ocean plastic on the beach in La Papachea. And so I highly recommend watching it. It's only a 15-minute documentary, but it can kind of open your eyes to what's possible with the technology, hopefully capture your minds a little bit and hearts. and maybe set a bit of an example for you guys of how you can, again, build this content and that will perpetuate a culture that we want to see in Ethereum. So thank you very much.